Hey everyone, I'm John Reardon and you're watching NWR TV. Koei Tecmo sits in a very interesting position with their Warriors series. After varied sales over the last generation, they suddenly had a major hit on their hands when Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity became the best-selling Warriors game of all time. While not every Warriors game has the advantage of being a major piece of Zelda lore, Koei Tecmo surely sees this success as an indication that there is a potential fan base for the series on the Nintendo Switch. Now, in Samurai Warriors 5, we see the first appearance of either of the original Warriors franchises on the system. But here's where I had some concerns. You see, while I absolutely loved Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, it didn't exactly run well. And that was a game built from the ground up for Switch. So how will Samurai Warriors 5, which likely wasn't designed with such restrictions in mind, fare on the system? Well, Koei Tecmo was kind enough to provide us with not only the Switch version, but the Xbox One version as well, which we're running via the Xbox Series X. It is of course worth noting that there is no official Xbox Series X version available at the time of writing this, but the Series X backwards compatibility ought to provide us with the ideal version of this experience. Let's start with the basic numbers. On Switch, we're looking at the expected drop down to 30 frames per second versus 60 on other platforms. For resolution, we're looking at something just shy of 900p, at about 864p. To be honest, I don't think image quality looks particularly good on either platform. Regardless of how you play this, you're presented with a very raw image that, to my eye, looks rougher than the actual numbers would suggest. The stylized art design doesn't do image quality any favors either, and both versions, I feel, exhibit more obvious aliasing than one would hope. This means a lot of stair-stepping around the edges of objects, and even some in-object aliasing that causes flicker on certain textures and motion. Some better texture filtering and anti-aliasing would do wonders for the image quality. But that's not really a comparison issue so much as a general note on the visual design. So what compromises are we seeing on Switch? Well, we can spot pretty much all of them right away. First is enemy density. A quick look at the opening moments of fights makes it very obvious that enemies are missing from the Switch version. This appears to be a draw distance change, as we can see them suddenly pop up here on the right as we run forward. Now the good news is that it looks like the actual number of enemies in your immediate surroundings is on par with other versions, but you will notice very obvious pop-in just a little farther out on the battlefield. Other changes have also been made to optimize on-screen geometry. The most obvious place we can see this is the removal of many of the trees that dot the edges of maps. We can also spot it in small details like rocks and rubble on the ground. Now, unlike the enemies I already mentioned, this isn't a case of reduced draw distance. These objects are entirely removed from the environment. Given that they include large objects like trees, I'd say this is the right call. I'd rather have these objects simply be absent than see them suddenly pop in out of nowhere. Shadows appear very different, but not always in the way you would expect. The simple explanation is that they're lower resolution, but there's a bit more going on than just that. Now, without knowing exactly how the engine works, I'll be making some guesses here, but I can give you the broad strokes. Essentially, if we look at the Xbox version, we can see that characters and objects in the scene cast a sort of dark blue shadow, while larger environmental shadows from big, distant objects like clouds, for example, cast a lighter shadow. This means that even when you are in the shadow of one of these large objects, you can still also see the shadow of your character. Meanwhile, over on Switch, you'll notice two things. Firstly, the shadows lose their blue hue and appear more gray. You'll also notice that there aren't two separate passes, meaning that when in the shadow of a large, distant object, individual character shadows are not visible. I suspect that both of these things result from a change to the underlying lighting system. That blue color you see in the Xbox version is likely the result of simulating proper atmosphere scattering. Similarly, the variable density of the shadows also likely results from a more complete simulation. Meanwhile, the Switch is using a simpler form of shadow casting that essentially just says, is there a shadow there, or isn't there? You likely wouldn't notice it unless you put the two versions side by side, but with that in mind, you do lose some of the bright, vibrant colors from the other versions when you take out those colorful shadows. Finally, to finish up on changes, we have lower resolution textures in most instances. This applies to both environments and characters. I do still feel that in most cases the textures on Switch hold up great given the lower rendering resolution. But now and then you'll spot something that looks a little blurry. It's also worth noting that even on the Xbox version, texture resolution is very hit and miss. The ground, for example, looks very blurry in every version. So with all those changes in mind, what is the result? How does the game run? Well, the news is largely good, and perhaps better than we would have expected. The game does stick very close to 30 frames per second most of the time, though frame time inconsistencies are pretty common. This means that while you may still be getting 30 frames every second, those frames may not be spaced evenly, which can lead to the impression of stuttering. It's also worth taking a quick look at Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity as a quick refresher. This game also targeted 30 frames per second, but suffered from regular and significant drops. Now, I do think that Age of Calamity presents a more visually interesting and maybe even complex world than Samurai Warriors 5, but it's hard to argue with the graph. On a purely technical performance level, this is an improvement. So what do you think? Are you willing to put up with all those adjustments in favor of a relatively more stable frame rate? I'd especially love to hear if you're someone who was introduced to the Warriors franchise by Age of Calamity, and if you're interested in branching out to other entries. Leave your thoughts in the comments, or just come talk to me directly on Twitter at JTSKnight92. You can join our Discord to talk about this, or anything else Nintendo, and check out our full review of Samurai Warriors 5 as well. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time. This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.